Welcome back, everybody. Showdown in the Pacific War is a deeply researched, richly detailed history of the origins and first years of World War II in the Pacific, focusing on the character and motivation of those involved, presented in an even-handed, eye-opening narrative. Showdown in the Pacific War is written by Ronald E. Martell, a native of Minnesota, honors graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School, a distinguished career in general practice law, as well as one of the nation's leading construction law practitioners, arbitrators, and mediators, holding positions in the Minnesota and American Bar Associations, as well as peer-selected organizations related to litigation and construction law. Nationally recognized for his nature photography as well, which includes 2 magazine covers, and now author of the critically acclaimed Showdown in the Pacific War, Ronald Martell, and he joins us on This Week in America. Ronald, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Rick.
I am looking forward to this discussion. It really is a unique perspective that you're bringing us on the early days of World War II. Just very briefly, as we get started, talk about your interest in this. I understand this is basically reading about history has been your hobby for nearly 60 years.
That's right. I started reading mostly about the war in Europe. I had an uncle who served in Italy and a cousin who went ashore at Omaha Beach on D-Day and then went with the First Army up through the Battle of the Bulge, and I followed that carefully.
This is a book that was a long time in the making. In fact, I think you started in 2008 and said this took a little longer than I anticipated. Talk about the research, because this has been highly researched. I believe you read, over 170 books plus internet and literally hundreds of documents. What was the research like in working on this?
Yes, it was lengthy, and it did involve putting together a lot of comments from different authors. And when you read history books, you'll find that one author will say this is true and another will say no, this is false. And you try to find out exactly what the correct facts are about it, and trying to present that in an even-handed manner is something that was one of my goals in writing the book.
In writing the research, I know the Battle of Midway Roundtable was a group very instrumental in your research. Tell me about them and the website as well, because they have very valuable information there.
The Battle of Midway Roundtable was an excellent resource for me. All manner of descriptions from veterans, and as well as comments from others. And I did have email exchanges with some of the authors, and particularly with retired Rear Admiral Max Showers, who was an intelligence officer in Pearl Harbor, and he was very helpful in giving me information.
We're talking about the new book, Showdown in the Pacific War. The author is Ronald E. Martell, our guest on This Week in America. Book is available at Amazon, all of the usual places. Information and the book available at Ronald's website, which is ronaldmartell, martell.com. Of course, you can link on directly to Ronald's website by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. As you sat down to write this, you said you had a couple of goals in mind. Being even-handed was one, presenting both sides, and I'm sure a lot of that goes back to presenting both sides and listening to both sides during the legal background, litigation background that you have. Also, you used a very unique literary device. Talk about that, because this makes the book fascinating to read. How did you come up with this idea?
It took a little while to evolve. But in doing the reading about the Pacific War, certainly I came across the descriptions of the acts of Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto on the Japanese side. They were the 2 premier admirals in the early stage of the Pacific War. And each of them had a staff officer whose lives I researched. There was Captain Edwin Layton, an intelligence officer who was with Admiral Nimitz throughout the war. He was the only staff officer for Nimitz who stayed with him all of the way. And Commander Yasuji Watanabe was a staff officer during the time when Yamamoto was the commander-in-chief of what they called their Grand Fleet or Combined Fleet. He was a gunnery officer and a planning officer. He was described as a noted author of history, as one of the most brilliant men he'd ever seen. He spoke very good English. Layton had spent 3 years in Japan learning to speak Japanese, and I had them sit down together at lunch, which was a fictional meeting, but they were able to talk to each other and explain just what was going on each side and the motivation. And the one nice thing about that is that you can present contrasting information in a paragraph. Otherwise, you read a history book, and what the Americans did is in one chapter, and what the Japanese did is in the next chapter, and it's harder to make the connections between the two.
And historically, this is accurate. It's very well researched, even-handed, as I mentioned. And as you're reading the dialogue between the two, you almost feel this actually happened, and you're sort of sitting at the table next to them and overhearing what actually went into these actions. Well, let's go back and talk about the early stages and actually what led up to World War II. Talk about what Japan was like as a country at that time.
Well, I start really looking at Japan from the time that Commodore Perry was opening up Japan in 1853. For several hundred years, the Japanese would only let foreigners land at one small island in Japan to do their trading. And after Perry landed, then there was a period of time with a tussle between the people who supported the emperor and the people who supported the shogun. The emperor was the spiritual leader of the Japanese. He lived in Kyoto. The shogun took care of all of the military and all of the administrative acts of the country. And he was at what was called Edo, which then became Tokyo later on. There was a battle, or there was a series of battles between the forces of the emperor and the forces of the shogun. And that was the nature of the Japanese society as Admiral Yamamoto was growing up. There was a great animosity for some years between the two forces, but that had disappeared at a time when Yamamoto could apply for a position at the Naval Academy. He finished second in a field of more than 300. He was a very brilliant man, very quick thinker. He was a leader that his people respected. He would not allow blame to attach to any of his subordinates. Anything that went wrong, he took responsibility for. That was a great character position for any officer to take, and the right one to take.
Now, he in the beginning was really opposed to Japanese position in this, in getting into war, as I read.
Say that again?
Yeah, he was opposed to the war in the beginning, correct? He had some misgivings about Japanese involvement in the war, in getting an engagement with the U.S.
Oh, yes. Yamamoto had spent time in the United States. He was the military attaché in Washington. He traveled around the country. He had also been a student there. At least he was enrolled for a while. He looked into the oil industry in the United States and in Mexico. He saw the industrial capability in Detroit and Chicago. He saw the farms. He saw people who were self-reliant in the United States. He knew that there was no way that Japan could defeat the United States. And the only thing that could be done was to have a war that ended in a negotiated peace very quickly. He was asked about the Japanese chances in the war, and he told a prime minister that he could run wild for 6 months, maybe for a year, winning all sorts of battles, but after that he didn't have much confidence in how the war would turn out. He was against a war with the United States.
Ronald Martell, our guest on the program. The book is Showdown in the Pacific War, A History of the Origins and First Years of World War II in the Pacific. Ronald Martell, again, the author. His website is ronaldmartell, martell.com. The website has information on the book. It's an excellent website. The book is available there as well as Amazon. Of course, you can go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and link on directly. With that information on Yamamoto, let's go back to what led up to Pearl Harbor. And as I'm reading it and understanding, he really was the one that pushed for this attack on Pearl Harbor. In fact, he threatened to resign if he wasn't given permission to carry this out.
Yes, that's correct. The war really began with the Japanese being at war with China starting in 1937. And over time, there were these horrible slaughters of Chinese. More and more it came into the news that the war in China was something that just could not be stomached by President Roosevelt. And so there was a series of embargoes of petroleum products and iron and steel from the United States. It got to the point where the only thing the Japanese could do was to invade to the south, to the Dutch East Indies, and take oil and rubber and other minerals and commodities from the south. Now, to do that, the Japanese would have to sail past the Philippines, and they did not believe they could do that without going to war with the United States. Yamamoto looked at the plan and saw that any movement to the south would leave a flank wide open on the east side, and he believed that the only way to prepare for the war was to make an attack on Pearl Harbor, and that would solidify a defense for the Southern Fleet and would have the advantage of being able to take ships of the United States out of the war on the first day of the war. So yes, he wanted to do it. Japanese admirals and naval staff were opposed to it, and he did have to threaten to resign before they made the decision to go ahead and allow the Pearl Harbor attack.
It's interesting you point out in the book we're talking about is Showdown in the Pacific War by Ronald E. Martell, that there were warning signs that the U.S. missed, including the very day, the morning of December 7th. There were signs, clear signs, appear to be clear signs now in hindsight, that were just missed by the authorities.
Yes, that's true. There were mistakes in Washington and at Pearl Harbor. In Washington, the Army and the Navy were able to read coded messages of the Japanese diplomats. And there was a long message that came in part on December 6th, finished on the morning of December 7th, with instructions to the Japanese ambassador to present the document to the Secretary of State at 1 o'clock Washington time. Well, that would have been 7:30 at Pearl Harbor. And there were several people who understood that the significance of the time of 1 o'clock could mean a potential problem at Pearl Harbor. There were delays in coming to a decision of how to report that, and then the communications to Pearl Harbor were compromised in the sense that there was a lot of static on the line. supposedly the message was going to be sent by Western Union, and it didn't get delivered until after the battle was over. Before that, there were several other messages that were intercepted that indicated the Japanese were interested in what was going on at Pearl Harbor, where the ships were berthed, and some that showed that the possibility of war would come sooner than anyone expected. And those messages were not sent to Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7, there was an alert, and a destroyer of the United States Navy under the command of William Outerbridge saw and fired on and sunk a Japanese submarine trying to get into Pearl Harbor. Outerbridge reported that, but for some reason it got completely delayed up and down the line and really didn't get to anybody in command in time. There was an experimental radar station on the north shore of Oahu, and two privates manning that station noticed an in-flight of a substantial number of aircraft, something they'd never seen before. They reported that, and the officer who took the report thought that maybe it was planes coming from some carriers that were at sea, or possibly a flight of B-17 bombers coming in, and told the privates not to worry about it. He did not pass that on. So there were several things that could have alerted Pearl Harbor to commence a defense, and that just went by the boards.
We're talking with Ronald Martell. His book is Showdown in the Pacific War, a history of the origins and first years of World War II in the Pacific. Ronald's website is ronaldmartell.com. That's MARTELL.com. Book information available at his website, of course, at Amazon, other book outlets. Information by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and you can link on directly to Ronald's website. A couple minutes left in the program. In the book, you deal with the Doolittle Raid, the Coral Sea Midway, you called the turning point of the war, Guadalcanal. A couple minutes left in the show, and an interesting aspect of the book, and one that you said was basically a trigger in getting you started in the research for the book, is the Yamamoto's plane being shot down. Still
Yes.
thinking that maybe this was an assassination ordered by FDR. What were your findings on that?
There was that puzzle, and that challenged me to find out exactly what the true facts were. Books said anything from President Roosevelt ordered the strike on Yamamoto to some that said he didn't know anything about it beforehand. The message got intercepted at Pearl Harbor and in Washington of the itinerary for Admiral Yamamoto to visit bases in the Pacific, and where he would be and when he would be there. And an attack was mounted by P-38 fighters, and that shot down Yamamoto's plane and killed him. Now, what challenged me was trying to figure out what it was that Roosevelt did know or didn't know. And based upon my research, I came to the conclusion that since Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, a cabinet officer, knew of the attack, he definitely would have talked to the president about it. The president was on a train trip at the time and was going down to Warm Springs, Georgia, where he had a retreat. And I think during that time, he did learn of the attack beforehand and just simply let it go forward. There was nothing he had to do to order it. It was something that Admiral Nimitz wanted to do, and the president would not interfere with the judgment of someone at the level of Admiral Nimitz.
One of the fascinating stories you will read in Showdown in the Pacific War, and I understand that you're working on a sequel. This would concentrate on President Truman's use of atomic weapons. You're working on that now?
Yes, I'm doing that now. I'm still in the research stage of that, which will take quite a while. But what I found is so many, many books that have different views of his decision, those that supported it and those that attacked it for many, many different reasons, and trying to determine on an even-handed basis what was going on in Japan and in the United States and what the need was for the atomic bombs. That is something that I'm researching right now and will be writing.
And I am looking forward to reading that book. With us on the program, Ronald E. Martell, that's Martell, Showdown in the Pacific War, A History of the Origins, First Years of World War II in the Pacific, told through a fictional meeting of two high-ranking officers, chief of staffs. It's a fascinating read. It's available at Amazon, wherever books are sold. Information available at Ronald's website, which is ronaldmartell.com. And of course, you can link on directly to his website by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Ronald, it was a pleasure reading the book, Showdown in the Pacific War. Great to have you with us on the program. The book is an excellent read. I'm looking forward to the sequel. Thank you so much for being with us on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate being able to talk with you, Rick.
It is our pleasure. And once again, the book is Showdown in the Pacific War. Ronald Martell, the author. Information at our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Stay tuned. We're right back after these important messages.